and welcome back to Colorado Politicking. I'm Pat Poblete, a legislative reporter with Colorado Politics, and joining me this week is the Capitol's ever-present chief political correspondent, Marianne Goodland. And for the very first time on this program, we're being joined by Colorado Politics political correspondent, Ernest Luning. Ernest and Marianne, how are we doing this week?
Fantastic. Week's almost over.
Doing good. It's a busy week.
So let's start off with probably what was the biggest news of the week, nationally at least, and that was in Minneapolis with the decision to find former police officer Derek Chauvin guilty of murder and manslaughter when it came to that really groundbreaking case with George Floyd last summer. And I think this is particularly pertinent for here in Colorado, at least for us, Marianne, because you have a big story coming on law enforcement. So why don't you give us a little bit of a preview of that?
Sure. Thanks very much, Pat. I took a look at what has turned into something of a tidal wave of law enforcement bills that are coming out in the 2021 session. One person told me they're tracking 40 bills this year, which is way above average. About 24 of them apply to how law enforcement does its job. So some of them are antagonistic, some of them are collaborative, and it's making for a very interesting session if you're interested in following how police does their job and the accountability portion of that. Pat, you covered House Bill 1250, which is what I've referred to as son of Senate Bill 217, which was last year's really groundbreaking police enforcement accountability bill. That bill went through a House committee yesterday, and Pat, tell us about that.
So, Marianne, this is a really big bill. I mean, the hearing on it itself stretched like 4.5 hours. So I'll try and give the 10,000-foot view and then move on fairly quickly. But really, like you said, this is building on last summer's historic police reform package. And in listening to the sponsors, who are Leslie Herod and Serena Gonzalez-Gutierrez in the House, who are both Denver Democrats, there really is a commitment amongst that party to continue doing the legislative work on police accountability. Now, this bill also drew some pretty strong backing from community stakeholders, from the ACLU, from the Colorado Criminal Defense Fund. And one of the points that I think was really well made is when it comes to police accountability, it's not just law enforcement stakeholders here, it's really anyone who interacts with law enforcement. We certainly saw that side of it. But when we focus on law enforcement specifically, the groups there representing law enforcement officers were really not very happy with this bill, really called for amendments. And one provision in particular that I'll focus on is limitations on the use of force. Essentially, the bill would require officers to go through really a battery of de-escalation techniques. And that was a problem for law enforcement agencies. They say that's not really practical in the real world. That's also where Republicans had some issues with this bill. Now, this was pitched in a way as going back and cleaning up some things from last summer's package, making it more clear. Republicans say this makes it actually less clear. This muddles the waters a little bit. And now, it's probably important to note on this as well that when it comes to police accountability in last summer, that package passed with really broad bipartisan support, particularly in the Senate, where only one member voted against it. Now, we'll have to see how this kind of develops through the legislative process, but so far it certainly doesn't seem like we're in for a repeat of that bipartisanship. But from there, Marianne, I want to go from the State House out to the campaign trail, and this is where I want to bring in Ernest, because Ernest, you've been really tracking a lot of the campaign finance numbers. So tell us where we stand with that.
That's right, Pat. April 15th was the deadline for campaign finance reports on fundraising for the first quarter, the first 3 months of the year. And it gives us a look at which races look like they might be hot next year, who's performing well. And there's already some tiers sort of sorting themselves out. Now, it's too early for there to be polling in any of these congressional races. So these are the numbers that we're looking at so far. To no one's surprise, the 3rd congressional district, where Republican Lauren Boebert is tearing things up. She's a constant social media presence, and she is the surprise member of Congress from last year. She upset a long-term Republican incumbent in a primary. She raised the most money out of any of the congressional candidates. She raised just over about $850,000, which is quite a bit, and that's from what I can tell, that's more than anyone has raised in the first quarter of an off year for a congressional candidate in Colorado. Hot on her heels, though, was Kerry Donovan, who's a state senator, who's one of about 6 candidates running to challenge her for that seat. Kerry raised about $650,000, and she did it in about half the time that Lauren raised a little bit more. She didn't get into the race until 55 days before the end of the quarter. So it looks like that's going to be the hottest race for next year. A couple of other candidates running in that district, Don Valdez, who's a state representative from Mahara, and Sol Sandoval, who's a social worker from Pueblo, raised some decent money for an off year, but not when the other candidates are raising up into 6 figures. Worth noting, too, 2 other candidates who don't yet have opponents, they're Democrats, both raised nearly $500,000. We have Joe Neguse and Jason Crow, who were both first elected in 2018. And both of them also coincidentally were, or maybe not coincidentally, were House impeachment managers. They had national exposure from that. They're both, Neguse was on TV all the time during the last quarter. He raised about $400,000. Jason Crow, who is the only Democrat who lives in something that's arguably a swing district, he raised $460,000. Keep in mind, none of us know where the final congressional boundaries are going to be for the 2022 election. We aren't going to know until this fall. So some of these folks could wind up in swing seats, while others could be looking at very safe seats. But that's what we've got so far.
And Marianne, let's go ahead and close things out back at the State House. And you really broke some news that's been making waves on Twitter this week. Go ahead and tell us about it.
Yes, last week, Representative Jenny Arndt, who is a Democrat from Fort Collins, resigned her seat. She was elected mayor of Fort Collins a couple weeks ago. Representative Arndt was chair of the House Agriculture, Livestock, and Water Committee, which meant that they were going to need a new chair. So they bumped up Representative Karen McCormick, who's only been a lawmaker for about 3 months. That meant who was going to be the vice chair. And Alec Garnett, the Speaker of the House, made what is a historical first. He appointed Mark Catlin, a Republican from Montrose on the Western Slope, to become vice chair. And the reaction to this announcement has been pretty stunning, very, very positive, as a sign of bipartisanship in an era where we don't see quite enough of that.
Well, Marianne, thank you so much for bringing us that news, for breaking it in the first place, really chasing that one down. For Marianne, for Ernest, I'm Pat Poblete. Thank you so much for spending some time with us this week, and we look forward to seeing you again next week.